All right, Shalom, welcome back. We are continuing with our study of the Amalekites in Egypt. Again, this is coming primarily from the writings of Immanuel Velikovsky, specifically Ages and Chaos. And right now we would be in chapter 2 of his book. There's a link to the PDF in the description where you can download the book and read along with it for free, or you can get a hard copy of the book on Amazon. Okay, so we're going to be speaking about these the king shepherds, the Hyksos. So the Israelites left Egypt a few weeks or perhaps only days before the invasion of the Hyksos. They could not avoid meeting these Hyksos coming from Asia, and actually did meet them before they reached Mount Sinai. So did the Israelites know that Egypt had undergone an 11th and very severe plague, one which endured for centuries, the invasion of king shepherds? When they sighted the Amalekites in the whirling and trembling desert, they might have been unaware of the new ordeal that these despoilers would bring upon Egypt. But while in Canaan, during the whole time of the judges, the Israelites who had suffered from the onslaughts of the Amalekites must have known that Egypt too was afflicted by the same plague, and to an even greater degree. Is there any reference preserved in the old Jewish sources that would hint at the Hyksos invasion of Egypt immediately after the departure of the Israelites? It is said in the enumeration of the plagues in Egypt in Psalm 78 that he, Yeshua, cast or sent forth upon them, meaning the Egyptians, fierceness of his anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble by sending evil angels among them. Now, what may that mean, evil or bad angels? There is no plague known as the visit of evil angels. There is no expression like evil angels to be found anywhere in the Scriptures, anywhere elsewhere in the Scriptures. There is an angel of death, or Satan, but no evil angels. It would appear that the text is corrupted. Now, sending of angels, presumably Mishlachat Malach Orim, or invasion of king shepherds, is Mishlachat Malachi Roim. So you can see it's extremely similar. The only difference in spelling is one silent letter, an aleph, in the first case. It would thus seem that the second reading is the original. So the thought is that it was probably at some point, somebody tried to either miscopied it or tried to correct something they thought was wrong and ended up corrupting the text. The first reading is not only unusual Hebrew, but is also contrary to the grammatical structure of the language. If roim, or evil, plural, was used as an adjective here, the preceding word could not take a shortened form. Roim must therefore be a noun. But if roim were a noun, it would be in the singular and not in the plural. And finally, the correct plural of evil is not roim, but raoth, evil angels. In correct Hebrew would be Malachim Roim, or angels of evils. Malachi Roe. Not only the sense, but the grammatical form as well speaks for the reading, invasion of king shepherds. When the editor or copyist of the sentence could not find sense in king shepherds, he changed the words to evil angels without sufficient grammatical change. So verse 49 of Psalm 78 must therefore be read that he, or Yeshua, cast upon them the fierceness of his anger, wrath, and indignation, and trouble, invasion of king shepherds. An old Hebrew legend throws a slight light on the same problem. Amalek fetched from Egypt the table of descent of the Jews, or Israelites. These lists lay in Egyptian archives. Amalek appeared before the Jewish camp, or Israelite camp, and calling the people by name, he invited them to leave the camp and to come out to him. The legend implies knowledge on the part of the Israelites of the fact that the Amalekites came into Egypt and became the rulers of the land. In what other way could they have come into possession of the census list in the Egyptian archives? And of course, in Papyrus Ipawer, it says that forsooth, public offices are open and the census lists are taken away. Serfs become lords of serfs. So even Ipawer refers to the census list being taken. And who would be taking the census list but the invaders, the Hyksos? When the Amalekites vanquished Egypt, they may have looked on themselves as the legatees of the former Egyptian empire with its colonies. In their wars with the Israelites in succeeding centuries, they may have argued that the Israelites had deserted their bondage in Egypt. So they probably saw the Israelites as their rightful property because the Israelites were slaves in Egypt, and now the Amalekites had taken control of Egypt. The problem of why in the books of Joshua and Judges, which cover more than 400 years, there's no mention of Egyptian domination over Canaan or any allusion to military expeditions headed by pharaohs has remained unsolved. Yet during this long period of time, according to the conventional chronology, Palestine was dominated by Egypt. So, nowhere in Joshua or Judges is Egypt even mentioned, and yet if the chronology that historians give us with Egypt should have been in control of all of Palestine at that time. The revision presented here places the time of wandering of Joshua and of Judges in the period of the Hyksos Amalekite rule over Egypt. In harmony with this revised scheme, the Amalekites must have been regarded at that time as the mightiest among the nations. So Balaam the sorcerer was called upon to curse the Israelites approaching Moab on their way from the desert. He set his face toward the wilderness, but instead of cursing, he blessed Israel with these words: His seed shall be in many waters, and his long shall be higher than Agag, and his kingdom shall be exalted. So Agag was the name of the Amalekite king. Standing on the edge of the mountain, Balaam turned his face in another direction, and when he looked on Amalek, he took up his parable and said, Amalek is the first among the nations, but his latter end shall be that he perish forever. These verses did not seem clear. The Amalekites were supposed to have been an unimportant band of robbers. Why were they called the first among the nations? And what could the blessing higher than Agag mean? No satisfactory explanation was presented. The Amalekites were at that time the first among the nations. The highest degree of power was expressed by comparison with the power of the Amalekite king Agag. He was the ruler over Arabia and Egypt. The name of the king Agag is the only Amalekite name that the scriptures have preserved. Besides the king Agag mentioned in the book of Numbers, there was another Amalekite king, King Agag, the last king who reigned some 400 years later and was a contemporary of Saul. So if you remember from the book of Samuel, where Saul goes to war against the Amalekites and captures King Agag. So there's two Agags mentioned. One was mentioned by Balaam, and then the other one in the book of Samuel. So in the history of Egypt, the most frequently mentioned name of the Hyksos king is Apop. One of the first most prominent of the Hyksos rulers was Apop, and the last king of the Hyksos was Apop. The early Hebrew written signs, as they are preserved in the stele of Mesha, show a striking resemblance between the letters Gimel and Pei. No other two letters are so much alike in shape as these. Each is an oblique line connected to a shorter, more oblique line, and is similar to the written number. The size of the angle between the two oblique lines constitutes the only difference. So here, this is at the bottom, I got a couple of illustrations from a chart of ancient Hebrew letters. I think that the ancient Hebrew that he's referring to is the two letters that are in the middle. You can see the gamel or gimel on the left side. So the center gimel, it kind of looks like a 7 that's crooked off to the side, and then the pei in the on the right there, the center letter is probably the symbol that Velikovsky saying you could almost get these two letters confused, and that would be the difference between Apop or Agag. Nevertheless, It seems that not the Hebrew reading, but rather the Egyptian must be corrected. I set forth some reasons in another place, which was this book, Worlds in Collision, that I've mentioned a couple of times. Almost every hieroglyphic consonant sounds for more than one sound, and only empirically are all the sounds symbolized by a consonant sound. Agag the first appears to be Apop the first, and Agag the second, Apop the second. King Agag reigned at the beginning of the period, according to Manetho. Apop was the fourth king in the Hyksos dynasty and ruled for 61 years. Agag the second ruled at the very end of the period, some 400 years later. The Amu Hyksos held Egypt in submission from their fortress in Ares, which they built near the border of the country. Throughout the land they maintained garrisons, and that was a reference to Manetho. In Palestine, there was likewise a fort which the Amalekites built for a garrison. It was strategically situated in the heart of the country in the land of Ephraim. The Song of Deborah, like the blessing of Balaam, is an old fragment. An obscure verse reads, "Out of Ephraim their root is in Amalek." There obviously refers to the Canaanites and to Jabin, the king of Canaan, who reigned in Hazor, and to his captain Sisera, who commanded 900 chariots of iron. They oppressed Israel, and the Israelites, under the guidance of Deborah and Barak, succeeded temporarily in breaking the yoke. The verse cited seems to mean that the strength of the Canaanites was based upon the support they received from the Amalekite citadel in the land of Ephraim. So basically this verse out of Deborah is a bit obscure because the people that wrote it understood what it meant, but to us, 3,000 years later, it's not quite as understandable, unless you take into account who the Amalekites were. Like the history that Velikovsky is revealing sheds so much light onto it, and now you can understand why that verse reads that way. The citadel is also mentioned in another verse in the book of Judges, Pirathon in the land of Ephraim, in the mount of the Amalekites. The Amalekites supported the Canaanites. This explains the reversal in the progress of the Israelite penetration into Canaan and their occasional status as vassals. The Amalekites ruled over vast territories and in their colonial politics allied themselves with kindred nations. This is the ground for the Hebrew tradition that the Amalekites posed as Moabites, Canaanites, and other peoples, and in these disguises carried on war against Israel, or that they supported the Canaanites in the war against the Israelites. The Midianites were close kin of the Amalekites, related since the days when the one people occupied Mecca and the other lived in Medina. Together they often invaded the land of Israel just before the harvest. So like in Judges 6, it says, "And so it was when Israel had sown that the Midianites came up and the Amalekites and the children of the east, and they encamped against them and destroyed the increase of the earth. Till thou came into Gaza and left no sustenance for Israel, either sheep nor ox nor ass, for they came up with their cattle and their tents, and they came as grasshoppers from a multitude, for both they and their camels were without number, and they entered into the land to destroy it, and Israel was greatly impoverished." The cattle and their camels without number are responsible for the Egyptian name king shepherds. Marching to devastate a country, they drove their cattle before them, and in the next chapter of the book of Judges, they and their cattle are compared to grasshoppers and to sand by the seaside. They employed the same system of exploitation and plunder as in Egypt. They waited until the peoples of the land had sown, then shortly before time of gathering, they appeared in a multitude with their herds to devour the harvest and to take away the oxen used for plowing and every other animal of the household. Papyrus Hermitage says that the Amu approached in their might and their heart rage against those who are gathering in the harvest, and they take away their kind from the plowing. The land is utterly perished and nothing remains. So you can see the same tactic of attack during the time of harvest is recorded in the scripture and in this papyrus. The time of wandering in the desert is reckoned as 40 years. The time of Judges is estimated variously, generally as 400 years. The Dark Age in the Near East continued as long as the supremacy of the Amalekites endured. The Israelites seem to have been the only people who incessantly struggled for their independence against the Amalekite and allied tribes, and by their resistance they also safeguarded the maritime cities of Tyre and Sidon. When under valiant leadership the Israelites dared to take the offensive, under Gideon they reached even the cities of Midian. It was a heroic time. Nothing is known of the uprisings in Egypt or other places of the Amalekite Empire during these centuries, but every effort on the part of the Israelites to achieve and retain real independence was doomed to failure as long as the Amalekites ruled northern Africa and Arabia up to the land of the Euphrates. As long as garrisons were stationed at fortified points scattered throughout many countries, and the military wedge they drove toward the coast between the lands of Africa and Asia remained unbroken. It was during this time that the saying was coined, "The Lord will have war with Amalek from generation to generation." So the Amalekites ruled until a king of Israel removed them from their position of power. And so we're going to get into this in the next video, and we'll see who this Israelite king was. So thank you for listening. Shalom, and have a good evening.